Good evening, and welcome to New Symposium. It's trustees, me and myself, Bob Love, John Todd, Mark McCormick, and Russell Fox. Politically diverse, but agreed that civil discourse in the pursuit of truth is eminently worthwhile, that discourse oftentimes needs to be rescued from the political parties, that templates and examples of civil discourse are, may I say, desperately needed in our rhetorical cultures. A relatively new, notable in our community, phoned last week and said he heard that we were, quote, smart guys asking hard questions. Well, in terms of our intelligence, some of us are frequently running catch-up, but at least we are not standing still. And yes, we realize the need to add some younger voices and the other gender. Look for that to happen soon. The trustees do ask themselves and their fellow symposiists questions with complicated answers on controversial topics. But the spirit of New Symposium is constructive, not destructive, hopeful, not downcast. So allow me a very short narrative to conclude my introduction, and then we'll get to the panelists. I rarely post on Facebook, but late last night, I posted a Pat Buchanan piece about Trump's immigration ban. What ensued was so interesting. Stiff political posturing, vitriol, some vulgarity, and an absence of calm detachment. Many of the respondents doing so from their workplace this morning. Granted, the Facebook sampler may not represent the American electorate, but concern exists that inflammatory discourse by people with entrenched views, developed perhaps too often by exposure to partial truths from heavily biased news media, is growing. The question is, what has happened? What is the future of news in our digital age? We're grateful to our panelists who will carry much of the rhetorical weight this evening. They will respond to questions and to each other at will, though not interruptingly. If the dialogue needs to move forward or add a question, I will intercede. And if you have a question or comment, you'll have to gain the floor from the moderator or from John. He's going to be taking the mic around. We want you to speak. We want the panelists, to have primacy. And so there is going to be audience interaction. If you have something to say or ask, we want you to have that opportunity. So, panelists, here's how we're going to start. I want each of you to introduce yourself. And my initial question is, what's your motivation for being here this evening?
Go ahead, Dave.
Oh, we're going to start down here?
You can start. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be in order.
Okay, my name's Dave
We
Trabert.
always start on the right.
Okay. Good. My name's Dave Trabert. I'm president of Kansas Policy Institute. KPI is a nonprofit organization. It's educational and research. We do a lot of work on state budget and education issues from a free market perspective. I'm also a board member of a new nonprofit called The Sentinel, which is an online news service dedicated to holding media and government accountable. Prior to joining KPI, I spent 30 years in the TV business, a few of them here at KTV. Started out as a business manager, eventually became a general manager, and moved around, as is often happens in TV, from one city to another with ownership, as ownership bought different companies and I'd get transferred. So I've seen news from the inside, helping to manage news departments, and learned a lot from motivations of working with those folks. And now involved with another organization that's kind of back in the news for me. So why I'm here?
What's your motivation?
Well, I was invited. But I gladly accept the invitation because I think this is a serious issue. It's part of the reason that I helped get the Sentinel started and served on that board because One of the big issues we face in the policy world is making sure that citizens get the information they need. There's always room for civil discourse and disagreement, but what we find many times is that people are reaching opinions based on only having partial or inaccurate information. And so we want to try to make sure people get the information. Whether they agree with us or not on our policy positions is up to them, but at least they need to have all the information so they can make a more informed decision.
Bob Love, and I'm a part of the new symposium, have been since its inception a couple of years ago, and I've found it to be always stimulating and thought-provoking, and so I'm here tonight because one of our panelists who was scheduled, Mark Marlette, was unable to come at the last minute. He said he had 2 kids at home that were sick and had passed their germs along to him, so he was couldn't be with us. I don't have experience in media.
You don't need it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have experience in media as a professional. I don't get paid for it. But I do have a lot of experience in communicating and with people, and I like to think I have some experience in thinking logically, and I know what the problems are for people who have to run a business and produce. So I feel like I can bring some perspective from the point of view of the journalist, the editor, the publisher, all of the 3 steps or 4 steps that news has to go through before it reaches us as news consumers. So I'm going to be trying to contribute where I can. A lot of these guys have practical experience, and I'm excited about the evening.
I'm Mark McCormick. I'm a part of the new symposium too. A couple things I wanted to do first. He didn't know I was going to do this, but I probably wouldn't be sitting here if not for Mr. Eby. His scholarship sent me to college. So you have him to thank, or Hillary, for the fact that I'm here. Secondly, when you were talking about the Facebook post and the vitriol, I was under the impression you were going to keep that between us. Announce that here. Thank you for doing that. I'm here ostensibly because I know what it's like now to be on the other side of the notebook, to be on the other side of the tape recorder. And I know what it's like to not feel heard. And in 2012, I left Wichita because I wanted to work at a newspaper before they all closed. And I took a job covering child poverty in the Ozarks. And about a year in, the museum called me and asked me to return. And I'll never forget the responses I got from people when I told them that I was leaving the newspaper. And I was personally gratified that readers and constituents who called themselves conservatives were particularly upset that I was leaving, because they said I was the only reporter there in their recent history who had treated them fairly. And I think a lot of what we're dealing with in media is not treating people fairly and not asking the right questions, and people are getting frustrated. So the degree to which I care about journalism, I remain a trustee at the University of Kansas where I went to school. I care about it. I care about how it's going to develop. And I wanted to be here tonight to be a part of some kind of constructive solution.
My name is David Seaton, and I'm with Winfield Publishing Company. We have daily in Cowley County and weekly in Newkirk, Oklahoma. And we just actually merged the long-time newspapers in both Arkansas City and Winfield into one bigger paper. It was mostly a business decision. Those 2 papers had been around for well over 100 years in their community, and so it was kind of a big deal, driven by the economics of today's media environment mostly. And I'm here because I was asked. I'm a fill-in for somebody who couldn't make it too. So it seemed really interesting topic, and I like to be. I'm used to more watching these on like C-SPAN or YouTube, than actually being up here. So I'm a little nervous, but I'll do my best to take part in the discussion. I'm interested also in learning.
Well, I'm Bob Weeks, and in 2004, I kind of underwent a little bit of transformation, started becoming more interested in government and public policy. Before that, I'd always worked in the information technology age, and so what I did was, knowing how to use a computer and so forth, I started a blog, The Voice for Liberty. That's at wichitaliberty.org. And I was especially motivated by an issue in the local news media. I felt that all the local news media was not really treating and handling a ballot issue in November of 2004 with the treatment it deserved. So that's kind of got me started there. A few years later, I got downsized from my Fortune 500 corporate job, and since then I've just worked on a freelance basis, and it does give me more time for the activism and type of things that I pursue. I think what really attracted me tonight was that last year the Oxford Dictionary Word of the Year was post-truth, defined as where objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. And I thought, boy, yeah, the presidential election this year, I think, was a striking example of that, and that illustrated some of the struggles I've been going through in the past dozen or so years. So thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. First question: when the cost risk of reporting is low, everyone can be a newsman. Is the free and open access of net neutrality really what we need?
We just jump in? Or?
Just jump in at will.
Okay.
You don't have to answer, but this is your opportunity.
Yes, I think free and open access is exactly what we need, but not with net neutrality. From our perspective, we don't think government should be in control of that.
Well, could you just explain net neutrality from your point of view so people can kind of get a better idea of that?
Net neutrality is where the FCC has some regulation over access and content. A lot of it sounds harmless on the surface, where they want to make sure that certain providers are not hogging bandwidth, so to speak. But once you get that government's nose under the tent, it's very easy to have government start restricting what kinds of content, and so that net neutrality I have a real problem with. Also, from my days in TV, the FCC has. We won't go there, but we could spend a whole evening on FCC issues. But free and open, absolutely. We need to have. That's one of the founding principles of this country. It needs to be free and open. Unfortunately, there will be some bad players get involved. That's always been the case. Long before the internet, before Al Gore ever thought of the internet, that was the case. And so you had the days of yellow journalism back in the 1800s, but it absolutely has to be free and open from my perspective.
Anyone else? Because I have some things I want to say about net neutrality.
Well, I think a lot of people, sometimes net neutrality debate has been framed in just access to being able to send bits along the internet pipeline free of different charges or tariffs or discrimination or something like that. And as far as journalism goes, which is kind of the focus of this tonight, I did a quick experiment last night. There was a New York Times story. It was about Trump fires acting attorney general, but it was a typical news story. I counted how many bytes of data it took to transmit that story with the photographs, with all the sidebar content, the advertisements, everything to my computer. And then I looked at how much bandwidth it takes to watch a high-definition movie on Netflix. And the answer is that New York Times story, with all of its content, took the amount of data that Netflix would use in 4 seconds. So, when you think about what's the value of 4 seconds of Netflix versus a journalism story, I think the idea of just fighting over this as being the number of bytes and the cost of them is really not as important as I think what Dave mentioned is just government regulation of who gets to be on the internet and what they can say.
I would agree with Dave that I wouldn't want the government involved. In fact, when I think about the internet, I think about its democratizing qualities. That if you do not have access to media, if your voice is not being heard, people today can go to social media and do some of that work themselves. I very much agree that we need to keep them out.
Well, I'm going to take a different point tonight because I don't think net neutrality is healthy. Here's the way I see net neutrality. You have various parties that are required to bring news to the public. And just let's think through them in our mind. And having a publisher here, like David, and a journalist here, like Mark.
Recovering.
Okay, a recovery journalist. But start with me in your mind and progress through the steps. Where does the news begin? An event happens. Some enterprising journalists, and I'm talking about journalists and reporters kind of as flip sides of the same coin, okay? Some journalist says this is something that people might be interested in, okay? And let's let the journalist then enter into the stream. He can't pass his news directly to the public, okay? In the internet world, he can do that. He can go straight to the public. But in the real world of news, he has to go through an editor. So what's the motive of the journalist? He can either be jaded and say there is no truth, which I doubt is the case with most journalists. I think most journalists tend to be idealistic. They have principles. They want to talk about principles. They want to get those principles to the public. So the journalist has to go through the editor. The editor is responsible, okay? He has to exercise responsibility. So when he sees that story, if there's libel in it, if there are, and this was the case with, I think, all the Ed Snowden stuff that was released, if there are things that have to be expunged before it can be published, he has to go through and do his job, all right? What happens next? The editor passes it up, and then you have someone, the publisher, who has to say, okay, this is on my dime. I'm the one who's going to produce this, all right? He says, go ahead and produce it, and who's left after that? The consumer, all right? So I think it's really important when we talk about net neutrality to get fixed in our minds that this isn't just free information. There's a cost associated with this information. Bob's point is excellent, I think. The costs are really hugely different for some of these. They may be small, they may appear small, but they're very different. The costs of what's going through the internet. Now, most of us think that net neutrality is an assurance that the government won't be involved in the internet. I completely disagree. Net neutrality is the government in the internet. And what it's done by entering the internet is say, we're going to disregard the costs of information. And when they do that, they begin to distort that entire process, that economic process of news going from reporter to consumer. They begin to distort it, and the government always, when it distorts resources begin to get poorly allocated. So what do you have as a result of net neutrality? Yes, you do have the ability for the kid on his computer who wants to blow away the world with 10 hours of heavy games using huge amounts of resources. And who's paying for those? I'm paying for them. But I'm only getting on to look at those 3 articles that were meaningful, substantial, thoughtful articles by journalists from the New York Times or from name 10 magazines that you would read. I mean, do you see what I'm saying? Do you see my point? Net neutrality permits, and when you go back to the consumer side, here's what net neutrality permits. Someone to sit on his Facebook account all day long without any cost and be unproductive, and not only unproductive, but he may be damaging his own cognitive development. So I'm going to say, in answer to Mike's question here, that net neutrality is probably at the root of a lot of the problems that we have with information coming to us through the internet. Now, argue with me, because I need to be argued with here.
Yes.
I'll take the other side. I think the way you guys are framing and defining net neutrality isn't quite right. So each company sends the internet to every particular home or business, right? It goes through a wire, right? And the company owns that wire. The same way they own the wire for the telephone or whatever, right? And so when the wire comes from the telephone, the government came in and said, you can't just charge $500 a month for your telephone because that wouldn't be fair. But the telephone company could do it because they own the wire and there's no control over it. So the debate here is, let's say Comcast, I'll pick a random provider, sends the cord to your house, and Comcast decides, you know what, I don't like Fox News. I hate them. I think they're wrong. I think they do terrible things. You know what they do? They can crush Fox News' website by restricting how much bandwidth Fox News gets, and because they can do that, they can actually control what the consumer gets. So let's say Comcast buys Amazon Prime. Amazon Prime is a competitor to Netflix. They buy Amazon Prime, they own both, they go, oh, all we got to do to kill Netflix is slow their bandwidth, we kill Netflix, we give free as much bandwidth as we want to Amazon Prime, and therefore Amazon Prime's going to win, and therefore we're going to win. So net neutrality is the same, is basically making the internet a utility in the same way we didn't allow telephone companies to charge $500 a month because we have no choice because there was only one phone line that came. It actually works similar with cell phones. So therefore saying, do we want the internet to basically work like a utility? I would say yes, because I don't want Comcast to be able to crush whichever company they're competing against and being able to work in collusion like that.
No, I'm not sure I understand, but let me ask you this. Couldn't the marketplace regulate that scenario as opposed to the government?
They have a monopoly on the cord that runs to your house.
I don't think that's the case
I
today.
don't-
There's
yeah.
several internet providers you can use.
One at a time.
Not
Bob?
everywhere. Not everywhere.
For the last, mile, that's the common term. I know in Wichita we have a cable TV company. We also have a major telephone company. There are other sorts of alternatives. There's going to be satellites pretty soon and blimps, I think, delivering internet service. We need that level of a competition to provide the services that people want.
My parents have one option, and maybe one day there will be another one, but while they still only have one option, I think they should be allowed to go to any news site they want and have equal bandwidth go with whichever one.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Why do your parents only have one option?
Because they live in a rural area and it's not worth the money.
And who provides the service to them?
Huntel.
Okay, so that's the local cable company. At the root of that is a government monopoly, because cities sell only one franchise. That's why most of us, if you live in Wichita, you have Cox. Because the city of Wichita did a deal, and this is the way it is all across the country, where the city says there's only going to be one cable provider because the city can make money off of that. So, getting rid of that government monopoly, I think would open up a lot of other things, because, of course, when government has granted a monopoly to one cable company, that certainly raises the cost of entry for anyone else to try to come in and get around that government monopoly. For example, like with satellite or something.
And I'd say with Fox News or with anyone else, if there's enough people out there who want to see Fox News, someone, an enterprising company, is going to figure out how to make Fox News available to those people because they'll pay for it. I don't see one supermarket as different from one internet service.
Google's trying to run wires to all these new places, and they're only in like 20 cities or something. I mean, the wires, it's that there's only so many wires.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's no question about the fact that infrastructure is a limit. But this is not an insurmountable limit. And net neutrality is warping the way information is handled. If you did not have net neutrality, there would be I think a very different topography of what kind of information is flowing where and how easily it's moving around.
Yes, sir.
Could I shift this slightly?
Maybe.
I think we have an optimistic view of how great journalism was in the past. When I was in high school, there were 7 newspapers in New York, which was rare for the United States at the time. Eventually, now it's down to 4. And most cities in the United States wound up with 1 newspaper at most. And the whole, you call it the John Peter Zenger principle of freedom of the press, really was saying that the government can't control entry into the business. And the idea is that competition would produce truth through the competition between ideas. But when you provide things free or close to free, and 75% of newspaper revenues wound up coming from advertising rather than from subscriptions, you wind up with a natural tendency towards monopoly and a lack of competition. And consequently, whatever the people running newspapers think is the middle of the road, even if it's way off from what most people think, winds up becoming a monopoly imposition on things. I think net neutrality is getting off of maybe what the fundamental issues are here. Is the internet encouraging more competition in the marketplace for ideas or not?
Well, I'm not. I don't think so, because I can be sitting in my house and pay so much per month for Cox, and the person next door to me can be sitting in his house and, as Bob said, using 1,000 times, 10,000 times the amount of resource that I'm using, and pay the same thing. So if companies were free to discriminate in charging, okay, there might be a whole different way that bandwidth would be allocated. I mean, and completely different results in the open marketplace. And you can't sit here and say, here's what the result will be, because there's millions of people all using those resources differently. That's the essence of a free market. Give people the right to discriminate, and you cannot discriminate if you have to give everyone the same price. That's what net neutrality is. Net neutrality is price fixing, as far as I'm concerned. And I think it has severely distorted the entire allocation of internet resources and uses, and it has made every man a publisher, because now every man can afford to publish. And so what we see is news that's no longer going through channels. You may have an 18-year-old who's reporter, journalist, editor, and publisher. And he can do it cheaply. Why? Because the government said you can't charge him for those services. And what happens? You get a proliferation of adolescent news, so to speak, and maybe it becomes fake news. And it competes with the people who are trying to produce a product. And they can't produce their product and compete with that. Confusion results. So I'm going to answer that question and say, we have a fundamental problem with net neutrality, and it's warping the entire way that news is being presented to us.
David?
I hadn't thought a whole lot about net neutrality, so I don't know if I have a strong opinion about it. But a thought occurred while you were shared, Bob. I think one of the problems, I see it as a problem, maybe other people don't, is that we're all now with social media and the way we can go consume information, we can go right to what we want to validate our own beliefs system that we don't. There's really not as much shared universal information anymore that kind of connects us. If we allowed providers and deals they've made with content providers to have their own channel or control over the information, might we actually create even more tribalism, more sectarian information identities that we have now today? I don't know. They're probably... I like your argument. I hadn't really heard it explained that well. My idea of net neutrality was sort of what we shared in the back, is that it's keeping the big companies from deciding what you, the guy at the phone, can get. So I appreciate what you made me think about it in a different way. But I'm worried about that. As a newspaper publisher who, when everybody read the newspaper, you read the same thing. Yeah. You couldn't go exactly to whatever political-driven channel or agenda-driven place for news where you could sort of feel comfortable with your own tribe. And it seemed like it connected us a little more, and we did have a sort of agreed upon set of maybe facts or information. It wasn't ideal, of course, by any means, but we were a little more connected, it seemed like, and we kind of agree on a basic set of facts or information. I'm speaking in general here, of course. I think that's one of the problems maybe that we're facing.
Brent, and then Mark.
Well, it's interesting. I think with the internet the way it is now, and the way it's been, I don't know how much net neutrality has been affecting it. I don't know how long. It hasn't only been like a couple of years, but it's really been an effect, I think, or maybe a year.
Net neutrality as a de facto matter has been around from the beginning. I mean, they were just trying to change it, and the minute they tried to change it was when it got officially ensconced by the FCC.
Is that your view of that too?
Well, I mean,
the FCC is net neutrality.
Right. When the FCC perhaps unconstitutionally declared dominion over the internet, what was a relatively recent development, it was simply an opportunity, in my opinion, for the government to get involved. They were looking for a reason to get involved and have some control over the internet. Government often goes looking for a solution for a problem that doesn't exist. And there wasn't, I mean, you could say maybe at some point in the future there might be, but there wasn't a serious problem at the time. And I don't think that it has anything to do with what we're talking about, the influence of social media. It's the internet is out there. The influence of social media has not been, in my opinion, impacted by the government getting involved in net neutrality at this point. That's kind of a separate issue to me.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to speak to something that you were talking about. I don't know if you're fans of Leonard Pitts, but he gave an incredible speech in Lawrence a few years ago, and he talked about how societies arrive at truth. And he talked about truth as fact stacked on top of fact, on top of fact, on top of fact, until at some point you reach an idea of a shared truth. And when we had a more newspaper-based media, we had a shared set of facts. It just seemed, to your point, that we had more of a community. As we're losing that, I think we're losing a shared sense of what truth is, because everybody comes at it from a different perspective. And on a more practical level, what we're losing that bothers me most is reporting rigor, which is your point. That I can remember going out and covering a story, and we had an editor at the paper named Jerry Ratz, and he was the toughest editor in the room.
Yeah.
So I handed him my story, and I promise you, with every change he made in that story, I got smaller and smaller and smaller, and he would groan and he would grunt, and he would look at me like, you went to journalism school? Till we got to the end of the story, my feet were just kind of swinging in the chair. It's that important to have that kind of rigor. The discussions that we have in our society operate without cross-examination, and that's the problem. And that the degree to which we lose that reporting rigor is the degree to which we're in the situation that we're in now, which is very dysfunctional.
I think I agree with what Mark says, and others have said too. But
Can you say that again? I want to report.
I think it's a mistake to look nostalgically at some sort of golden age of journalism. One of the most outstanding examples, I think, is I forget his name, but he was the correspondent from Russia, or Soviet Union, for the New York Times during the decade before World War II. And he said, oh, the Soviet Union is just great, even though Joseph Stalin was conducting, I think, the Holodomor, which was the forced starvation of millions of people in the Ukraine and other areas. Yet the New York Times was telling people that everything's just fine. We should emulate the Soviet Union. So it's probably easier to conduct false narratives today than it has been in the past because of the internet, as opposed to having to have an actual newspaper, magazine, TV station, or whatever. But, there's been problems for a while, I think.
And I also would agree with much of what Mark said in terms of if you can't have basically access to all the information, that you can have a loss of a sense of community. But I don't know that it's because we have more competition. I wonder, having been in the business for so long, how much of that was self-inflicted by the media. And I can speak specifically to the electronic media, choosing to make itself irrelevant. And I think some of that, I didn't work inside newspapers, but having been a consumer of newspapers and magazines, I think there's also mainstream media made itself less relevant to people.
How so?
Okay, so TV news is very drive-by. And some of that is by choice, because people think that, if it bleeds, it leads. And to some extent, you need to report on those things. But when that becomes the tail that wags the dog, well, this isn't really affecting my life. It's interesting to know why the red lights were flashing a mile or so away, but how did that change my life? And you get into you start chasing those things. There is, in fact, they are in the advertising business. That's how TV stations and radio stations and newspapers make their money. And so you have to be conscious. You have a news audience, but you also have an advertising audience. And if you don't find the kind of customers that your advertisers want, can you get people to read the story about the deadly salad bar and the restaurant ratings? Can you get people to watch the story about what this pawn shop did or the dirty hotel room? Sure. The question media people have to ask themselves is, will that bring in the kind of customer that has the spending power that my advertisers want? And when you don't do that, the more you get away from that, that's when you start having advertising problems. And and I've seen it from the inside. The lack of doing in-depth, thoughtful journalism is what sends some of your customers off looking for other alternatives.
But isn't good journalism a competing value with profits?
No, absolutely not.
It's kind of what I feel like you just said.
Do you mean good journalism competes with advertising? That's really what you're saying.
It's and again, I've seen this from experience. The last TV station I ran, I went into, it was in Youngstown, Ohio. It was last place station. It was losing money. It had been on a 4-year revenue decline. This was a community that it was still mourning the loss of the steel industry from the 70s. This was 2004. We couldn't be, if we only did the same thing everybody else did, do the same news, the same weather, the same, why come watch my station? We had to find a way to differentiate ourselves. And what we did was just kind of go back to journalism 101. Okay, what are the problems in this community? We don't have enough jobs. Why is that? They have the same kind of incentive programs, the subsidies, the loans, the everything, you name it, the laundry list. So we went out and started talking to Chamber of Commerce and government and universities. Why aren't people coming here? Well, they all knew the answers. They just want to talk about it. We had extraordinarily low education attainment. You think you have a problem here in Wichita with about 28, 29% bachelor plus percentage of adults 25 plus having a bachelor's degree. There it was 17%. Tax burden was exceptionally high. The people there didn't really understand it. They had a city income tax of almost 3% on top of the state income tax and the property tax. And it's like, well, they, in Pennsylvania they had it too. So it's like, no, but you guys don't understand. There's only 5 states in the country that have city income. So what are all these problems? We went out by looking at what are these examples, finding other communities that actually went through the same thing. They lost textiles, they lost steel, they lost rubber, and they were turned around. They had the courage to do something different. We told those stories to give hope. We went out and told, here's the reasons you have problems. The issue for the community is, if you want to be different, you have to be willing to change. You haven't changed up to this point. Within 1 year, we turned that 4-year revenue slide into a gain.
Right.
Our ratings didn't show it, but we could go in, because that takes time. That's a whole other story, the way those numbers are done. But we could go show advertisers that, it just made sense to them. We have people with spending power. We have people thinking who are looking for real information. This is the only place in town they're going to get it. We turned that revenue slide around and started growing revenue. I think it's media has a tendency to lose sight of what it's really doing. If you want to grow your business, you have to provide the audience to your advertisers they want. And people with spending power are thinking people. You have to have the courage to get rid of the things that aren't helping your community or your advertisers. And every media station does it, whether TV, radio, newspaper, they all have it. And they spend a lot of resources on it because we've always done it this way.
There's a cost associated with going out and doing what your paper did. You have to get the reporter, you have to get the journalist, you have to have the editor.
There's a cost, but you know what we did? And of course, right away, the staff all said, this is great, we want to do this. Now, we're going to have this many more resources in order to do it. It's like, no, we're going to stop doing the things that aren't productive, and that's where the resources are going to come from. That's something that in media is not an exclusion here. A lot of companies have trouble with that. Taking it, what does it take for us to be successful? Let's make sure we're putting the resources into that and stop doing the things that aren't productive. And the journalists were the ones who were mostly vocal about, we can't do this. And when you really dug down to it and talked with them one-on-one, a lot of that was, but my competitors, my friends at the other station at the newspaper, they're not doing this. I have to dare to get different. I'm not sure I have the confidence. And that got to what often appears as bias or just not covering something. If reporters don't understand an issue, if they don't really understand how this government thing works, or they don't understand the nuances of a tax policy, they'll shy away from it. Because, especially in the smaller the town, the bigger the problem becomes, because you're kind of a celebrity. And you don't want to be seen as not knowing this issue inside out, so it's easier to walk away from it.
Dave, let me step in. Just
sure.
Very interesting. given free and open access, given the current milieu in which every man's a journalist, the bad players have an increasing presence, the false narratives more opportunity, is the American electorate going to go for reliable information? Where do we go for reliable information? How are we going to be properly informed?
I mean, I think he was answering that question. It's a market question. Where does the consumer go for a good can of chili? It has to be demand, and then there has to be production. And if we're failing in production, it's because the demand is not willing to pay the price to get the quality of product that's being requested. But everything Dave says that's not true. He's saying that the customer, that the publisher can figure out a way to appeal to the person who wants that high quality product.
Is it the consumer failing the producer, or
I don't know that it's failing anyone failing. I think the answer, though, is, if it's how do we, I think we're moving on to number 2 here. How do you identify and maintain reliable sources of information? Cut off that when it streams together on social platforms. How did we do it, or did we even know that we weren't getting all the information before social media was out there? Because all we had was what was put in front of us. At one point, it was 3 networks. It might have been 7 newspapers, but how did we know they were all getting it right? We didn't know, we just assumed. I think the answer here is we have to be involved. Citizens have to be involved. We can't sit back and just assume that, okay, this is the reliable one. People make mistakes. Media companies make mistakes. And when they do, they don't often like to admit it. Sometimes they don't even know that they're not giving you the whole story. People have to get involved and compare. I don't think you can. I think it's the benefit of social media and the internet. You can look at you can compare a lot of other information. You got to be really careful with something you've never heard of. But you have the opportunity now to very easily compare state and local and national media, looking at different stories, and look at them and educate yourself on the issues. Don't just assume that media is going to give you, or any one thing is going to give you everything you need to know about it.
Trying to talk for an hour.
That's part of what I wanted to speak on is like 3 basics for neutrality. It's from the top, you still got where somebody can run the show and they can run it corruptly to where it's news fixing. If I'm running the show and I'm corrupt, how do you stop that? You don't stop that with the people if I'm running this production. So we got to figure out how to make that neutral. And that's where the news, social media has been so powerful, because now you're getting to hear a different perspective that I wouldn't give you before. So neutrality has got to start at the top and the bottom. We as consumers on the bottom, we've been paying that dollar every time. The tax dollar has paid for all of this. The very inventions of all of this was paid by the tax dollar, and we haven't got a cut yet. We need to be talking about how to make this net ban neutral for the people all the way around, from the bottom and the top. We got to figure out how to do that with a panel. That's the only way that's going to come together, because the top ain't going to give in because they used to getting money, and on the bottom, they're unaware. You got the people somewhere in between that's got to figure it out, and collectively, you'll enlighten the people. And when the people, there's an awareness movement going on right now. People are starting to learn because of social media that never had a chance to learn that before. You've only been getting one side of the story. I own this media. I'm going to tell you what I want you to know. I don't care how good my journalist is. I won't run that story, or I'll run a piece of that story until the other companies over there start running it. And now I'll compete with them a little bit and say, okay, yeah, we knew this too. But corruption is the head of what's going on here. Until we face the corrupted part of it, we ain't gonna get nowhere.
Are you talking about the access or the content?
Both.
Okay.
All.
You're talking about.
I'd like to just respond
Yeah, sure.
to Dave's comment about good journalism. And my heart is, I'm a news guy. I went to journalism school. I worked in as a reporter in Florida and California, and then I came back to join the family business, and I got into the money end of things and got really, corrupted. And but my heart is with you. But and I walk through the doors every day, think, okay, what can we do, what can we put on the front page tomorrow that's really going to make a difference, be interesting, compelling, and stuff like that. But it's not that simple. There are pressures on traditional media because of the way the information revolution has taken place. I mean, I think our papers have done pretty good community journalism, but we've seen the decline in advertising, we've seen the decline in revenue and in paid subscribers, because people have more options now to get information with social media and with the internet, and it's just a different climate altogether. I worked for the Press Enterprise in Riverside, California, a great newspaper. That's probably where I learned the most. They won Pulitzer Prize back in it was a while ago. Really good editors, layers of editors, a big suburban paper, and now they're a fraction of what they were, and it wasn't because they wanted to stop doing good journalism. It was the demand, the changes, the disruption in the media climate and how people are consuming information now, and they're still doing some good journalism, and they're still publishing a newspaper, and a lot of us are, and of course we're all putting our stuff out on the internet too, paid or unpaid or partially paid. Those are big questions that every publisher always deals with, but that's probably why we're sitting up here. Is it's not that simple anymore.
Yeah.
Just do good journalism and expect that you're gonna keep the doors open and make some money and reinvest.
I think what we're ultimately talking about is the loss of truth, and as you were saying that I did view a lot of my coworkers as idealistic people.
Yeah.
We weren't thinking about profits. We're taught not to think about profits. It doesn't matter how much it costs to go and cover whatever happens in the next state.
Right.
That's our charge. We need to go and find the truth. When you're trying to balance that, because it is a business, that's where we've run into problems. And we've actually in media, for a while, we've gotten really good at telling really good stories about news. So one of the things that I regret about tonight is that Buzz Merritt couldn't be here. Because in his book, which I would highly recommend, it's called Public Journalism, it changes the paradigm of journalism to get at the question that you were asking. What kinds of things can we do to recover trust in media? Because what we had done is we'd gotten very good at telling the public what was wrong, and we offered no solutions, to the point where we overwhelmed readers and they started withdrawing from public life. And what he said in the book, which is really interesting, is that the decline in newspaper readership, the declines in circulation, track almost perfectly with declines in voting. It was that important when we had that kind of shared society. Those two things were very important. So the more newspaper people like you had to think about the bottom line and make bottom line decisions based on money, that shrank your newsroom's ability to do the job that they wanted to. It affected the quality of the journalism. And when the quality was diminished, the trust was diminished. And that's what we're in now. We're in this downward spiral.
And when the trust is diminished, the consumer becomes indifferent.
The
because
consumer,
he says I can't trust them
the
anyway.
consumer goes away.
Yeah. He's
So
gone.
we can't deliver audience to advertisers anymore, at least not at the same price.
That's right.
So we lay off people to make margins at the end of the year. So you have fewer people doing more work. And you're producing a product that has significantly less quality, so there's no audience. You can't deliver it to advertisers. You lay off more people, and that's what you've seen. That's why I'm sitting here today, rather than in the job that I'd always dreamed I'd retire in. He's making a very good point.
Bandwidth, the prices of the bandwidth. I'm not sure if I'm understanding that.
Yeah, just think of
Let's
bandwidth.
the prices of reporters and the time it takes to flesh out stories. I think that's the cost we're worried about. But there are other ways to deliver news, opinion, and research. It's been going on for a while, and that's philanthropy or foundation journalism, primarily conducted through think tanks. So, for example, the Cato Institute, not only do they have long scholarly studies, but they have commentary almost every day about the news of the day. And there's, for example, the Center for American Progress, which is on the other side. These operations do not have to have advertisers in order to thrive. They have donors, philanthropists who believe in the mission of these. But then the problem is, people say, Cato Institute? Oh, that's Charles Koch. He founded that. You can't believe a word he says. And the same thing for John Podesta, whoever is in charge of the Center for American Progress. He's just a Hillary Clinton sycophant. How can we believe anything that they produce? So,
and that's largely true, though, isn't it? Is that they do have, almost all of the think tanks have their own bias.
Absolutely.
They're
So
not
that's-
doing Leonard's fact on fact on fact on fact to get truth and dialogue. They aren't doing that.
Frankly, a lot of newspapers and TV stations aren't doing that today either.
No, they're regurgitating what they get from one of these foundations that you're talking about.
It's worse than that. Dave, to his credit, someone at Kansas Policy Institute last fall found the Wichita Eagle had editorialized about huge losses in construction jobs in Kansas being caused by Sam Brownback dragging money out of the transportation fund to spend on other types of stuff like that. Well, Kansas Policy Institute looked at it, and then I verified, and the loss in construction jobs in Kansas was at 2% was attributable to a drop in highway construction. The rest was other construction. Do you know who the Wichita Eagle relied on for those numbers? He relied upon a lobbyist. The editorial board did, a lobbyist for highway interests whose job is to get more spending for more bridges to nowhere, so to speak, no matter what the cost is or what the need is. And the Wichita Eagle editorial board took that and ran with it.
And
it was
even
cheap.
Though, and by the way, Bob, it took me less than 10 minutes to verify that.
It took me
Because
longer
of the
because
value of the internet. Here's lobbyist says this. I know where to go look on the website, on the internet for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Not true.
But still you have
Media
to do...
doesn't do it, and a lot of times they don't do it for different reasons, but a lot of it comes down to it's the reporter's perspective. It's the story they want to be able to tell. Media's job isn't to tell you what to think. It's to give you the information so you can think. And by the way, they continue to repeat. Media generally still repeats. If the lobbyist
Topeka Capital
says,
Journal did a similar
same
story
thing.
on that.
You've probably, here's another, go ahead, I'm sorry. I'll shut up.
Well, I thought.
One thing I appreciate about the internet, right, is that you can find different perspectives out there, and scholarly perspectives. Studies that have been done, and they have various different, kind of truth sorting things. So if you get something on Facebook that says, Donald Trump did this, you go truth or whatever it is, truth or dare. I can't remember. It's so many called right now, but there's several different ones. Snopes, and stuff.
Snopes, yeah. I like Snopes.
And then they can.
I like Snopes.
A lot of them have already kind of vetted it and that sort of thing. It can give you the different perspectives and that sort of thing, and then you can kind of check them too with other sources and that sort of thing. So that's very helpful, because right now the problem with news all the way through the 70s is that most people didn't have any way to get any very detailed information. It was all soundbite, and it was all aimed at just whatever was the most outrageous thing they could tell to try to get people to come and watch what was happening on TV. And so you ended up not getting very deep information about things. But I mean, to me, what journalism is supposed to do is just go out and say, this is what people are saying here, this is what's happening here, and just tell what happened. And then they can ask a couple other people. They don't need to give solutions. They need to present different sides of the issue and tell the facts. That's what they're supposed to be doing. But they've gotten away from that. I sat at Wichita State University and saw my own cousin, who was an anchor woman for Cake TV, come up and start talking to these people. And says, did you hear about what Governor Brownback did about this executive order about homosexual marriage or something like that. And they're like, no. It's like, well, we want to do a story about how the students are up in arms about this and they're upset about this. And we go, okay, well, what is it? And she said, and so then she starts educating them from her slanted point of view about what this is, you know? And says, so can I get you guys saying, we think that Brownback is wrong, what he did was wrong and bad. And they're like, oh yeah, we could do that. After they got educated and everything like that, and then she had her camera there and took a picture of them. She's manufactured, that's propaganda. That's not news. That's not telling facts. That's not giving both sides of the story and letting people decide.
Why has the news become endless political campaigning? What has happened to us? Why is it?
When you say the news is political, you mean the
newsmakers? They seem to be endlessly politically campaigning. Whether you're at the Facebook level or whether you're at the New York Times.
You mean trashy Trump?
Or just either right or left. It's endless political campaigning.
Could we let her?
Well, I was going to say, I think too many news stories now, according to what Brett's saying, they no longer, unquote, present the facts and let us decide. It's all peppered with a lot of adjectives and adverbs that are slanted. So like he's saying, they're taking a story that could just be a set of facts and let you and I decide what we think about it, but they're couching it in a lot of throwing in their own opinion in there in ways that are just adjectives and adverbs in there to say what it is.
Why do you think that is? Let's mull that for a while. What has happened? Why is it that we're content to let the news become political campaigning?
Well, I think from my perspective as a libertarian is simply that government does too much. As time goes on, the share of gross domestic product or income that's consumed by government at the federal, state, and local levels is generally on a rising trend. And so a lot of what we might be able to do, like say by choosing a grocery store or whichever one we want. No, instead we all have to pay for the schools or the same streets or whatever it may be. So I think that we try to do too much through politics, and there's too much at stake. Either
and that influences coverage.
But why the cutting adverbs? Why the hostility? Why the half-truths?
May not cover honest coverage, but it certainly does opinion color. I think the opinion advocacy journalism, which is okay, but then also what people will share on Facebook. You know, I'm in favor of more school spending, so I'm going to say everything Kansas Policy Institute produces is a lie.
Yeah.
Simple as that.
Why is it? Why can't we be fair?
Well, I think part of it is we have a fault as a consumer too, because if we don't like. If I look at that and I say the Eagle, for instance, is slanting the news a lot, or any other newspaper, then if I let them get away with that, it's partly my fault. If I say to them, I'm not resubscribing, and here's why I'm not, because I don't think you're treating the news fairly. Or, you know, if I read somebody's blog spot on the internet, I know the direction they're coming from usually. So I evaluate that based on what I know about who's writing it. And if it's presented as a news story, I don't expect to have their opinion in it. If I let them get away with it, I guess that's part of my fault. So I think we as consumers are letting this happen too.
I think that's a really important point, that we think of media and audience, but it's really a relationship. And the degree to which media organizations have relationships with their readers, with their viewers that hold them accountable, what I think happens a lot is media starts trying to produce what they think consumers want as opposed to what they really need. And that's taken us down a different road. But I think your point is really important.
Yeah.
That there's a symbiosis there that
I'm noticing, I just jotted three.
Speak as loud as you can.
Okay, I'm sorry. The other thing I jotted down here was I have a habit of picking up when we receive at home some printed news that, for instance, active aging. I pick up Community Voice at the grocery store because I want to get that viewpoint. East Wichita News addresses our end of the city. These are print media that are aimed at a particular audience, and we support those. And I know the direction they're coming from, so I trust what they're saying. I mean, I trust that what they say
Yeah,
is
let's
truthful within their perspective, I guess.
if we stay on that notion of producer and consumer, okay? If we stay on the notion of producers and consumers, I mean, Mark was saying consumers are opting out. Just they're stopping voting for the same reason that they're stopping reading the newspaper, because doesn't make any difference anymore. They're indifferent to it. But if you go look on the producer side, okay, what does every producer want? Dave used a term early on, about 30 minutes ago, and I just wanted to jump in and say, let's focus on that term. What does every producer want? What?
It's an audience.
Eyeballs.
What do they want?
Consumer.
Eyeballs.
Money, okay? Producers are different than these journalists. The journalist has a mission, all right? The editor is standing in between the publisher who wants money and the journalist who wants to get a message out, all right? Now think about this. The publisher wants money. What's the best way to get money? Eliminate the competition, right? If you can eliminate the competition, you can get money. Now, what we see happening everywhere around us. Look at every industry that on the face of the earth right now. What's happening to them?
Corner in the market.
They're consolidating like never before. They're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And we don't have this diversity of information anymore. How are they getting so big? Where are they getting all the money to do the leverage buyouts to reduce all the competition? They're getting it from the government. The Federal Reserve has lowered interest rates to 0. So Comcast and AT&T and everyone else can go out and buy as many news organizations as they can, consolidate all the news. The fellow in the back who was worried about the fact that one company now has too much power and they can control what they're going to say and what they aren't going to say, he's got it right. They do have power, but it's not because the marketplace doesn't work. It's because the government has stepped in again and provided a way for news production to become consolidated and controlled and to eliminate competition.
Can I push back on that just a little bit? Do you mind?
No, please.
What I think happened, and I wish I could remember the book, but what I think happened to newspaper media, and that's the only thing I feel comfortable, speaking on, is, legacy newspapers. That in the late 60s, early 70s, most newspapers had really high profits. I mean, 15, 20%, sometimes more. And they decided that they wanted to go public. Now, before they went public, those profits were flat year to year. But as soon as you go public, that line needs to do that. And they couldn't sustain it. And that's
you're talking about
true.
Buzz Merritt's book Nightfall, which tracks the
yes, sir.
exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and that's what led to the spiral that I was talking about before. Secondly, as I said, I did work at a newspaper, and in the 5 or 6 years that I was out of newspapers and then I went back, I was astonished at how meager the resources were in newsrooms and what they were asking reporters to do. So every now and then I'd get sent to cover a fire. So they issued everybody an iPhone. On your way to the fire, before you walked out of the room, you had to tweet and put something on your Facebook page. You go to the fire, and while you're there, you're almost not taking notes. You're dictating into the phone and sending it to the desk. You're taking pictures there too, and you're taking video. So after you've dictated several of these paragraphs, you're coming back, you're still dictating. Someone on the desk has assembled the story. And then you're supposed to do a write-through several times every minute so that your website changes because people want the clicks. And the more clicks you get, the more audience you're delivering to your advertisers. I'm telling you that having done it, reporters are too busy to be thinking about, well, how can I sabotage, what Bob Weeks is doing, and how can I sabotage, what these other people are doing. They are working their brains out. And they're typically kids right out of school because people with institutional memory have been shown the door. I can't tell you, it's been years since I've seen anyone retire in a newsroom. It just doesn't happen. There are a bunch of kids, and then as soon as they wear them out, maybe some of them go to another newspaper or they wash out. So I just think that there are realities in newsrooms that even I was unaware of, and I consider myself someone who's pretty knowledgeable about them.
Well said.
Yeah.
John Todd, did you?
I'm just going to make a comment. When the newspapers, when they get bought out, they do these things you're talking about. The thing that bothers me is that the groups that were tied to the community are now gone.
Yeah.
That is destructive.
And it's not just newspapers, entire companies' roots are gone.
Well, one more thing, I'm sorry, I gotta say this. So, our newspaper here was very profitable. I think people will tell you that. And yet, because we were part of a group or a chain, a lot of the profits from the Eagle were being drawn off to support papers in states where the market had just absolutely crashed. So the Bees, the Fresno Bee, the Sacramento Bee, they were missing their margins, by huge percentages. We were, I think, the third most profitable paper in Knight Ridder, and yet our revenues were being drawn off to prop up these other entities. The idea that they're not locally owned really has been the death knell for a lot of. Because if you go to Tulsa, for example, that is locally owned, their Sunday paper looks like an actual Sunday paper. It's thick. Our Sunday paper, you can floss with it.
Sir.
Yeah,
And then
I had a few comments. You can speak to this if you want, but I think the death of the newspaper is totally imminent. I mean, if someone hands me a piece of paper, I scan it, I send it to Google Drive, I put it in a file, and I throw that piece of paper away before I've left the room. I have that piece of paper forever. I could print it off if I wanted to again. I can look at that piece of paper on my phone, at my computer at work, at my computer at house, forever. And so how I consume all things is on a screen, and that's anyone under the age of whatever, pick that number, that's going to be their future and their life. And therefore newspapers, to me that's just like the reality of the case. I mean, you can say it's not true, but I'm 33. Everybody younger than me doesn't use paper.
You're an overconsumer.
What's that?
You're an overconsumer because it's too cheap. And it's too cheap because of net neutrality.
I don't know what cheapness has to do with it. I pay for my scanning program. I don't know what and if I use too much storage on Google Drive, I pay for that too. But
look at the American public. The American public is over-consuming everything.
I don't know if
Internet's no different.
How that relates to the fact that people aren't going to use paper anymore.
All this stuff that you scan and store, do you read it?
Sure.
You read it all?
Yeah. I read more now that I have a phone with me than I ever have in my life. I listen to books in the car while I go. If I'm sitting in a doctor's waiting room, I can read. I mean, I do more reading now than I ever did when I was reading the Omaha World Herald back when I was in high school. I mean, I read more now than ever. So the newspaper going away is just is a result of just people are going to consume things differently. Now, what I would also say about that is there doesn't have to be a thing like, well, newspapers have editors and they have standards and websites don't. Like, you can have a website with no standards. You can have a website with standards. You can have a newspaper with no standards. You can have a newspaper with great standards. So, my favorite thing to consume is the NBA, right? I love reading about the NBA. I know insanely ridiculous large amount of the NBA. The people that do the best job in the NBA I can find is a guy named Nate Duncan. He's a former lawyer. He used to write, and all he does now is podcasts. That's all he does. He was a lawyer, so he read the collective bargaining agreement and knows it better. And how does he give that information? In a podcast. That's how he does it. So having high standards is not tied to paper or anything else. But however you get that out to people, you can give it in high standards or low standards. So,
really good point. I'm really glad you came.
One of the lessons, I think, just quickly from the Nightfall book that Mark brought up by Davis Merritt is that I think he really laments the death of newspaper-style journalism. I think that's the word he used. It's different than television journalism or radio journalism. It's something that moves at a slower pace, is more reflective, and there's introspective. And whether that's delivered on the flesh of dead trees or on your iPad or iPhone or whatever, I think that's largely, I don't want to say largely, but it doesn't matter as much as the process that went into producing that content.
Good point. We have 3 people, this woman and 2 gentlemen, to comment, and then I have 2 questions. One I certainly want to ask before we're done at 8:30. You ma'am?
I think we've all established that it's difficult to find a reliable source of information, that we all struggle with looking for and finding objective information about what's happening. I would be curious to know if each one of you could respond very quickly. If you only could access one source of information, what would that be? What is your most reliable source for objective information that's not biased?
Well, for me, it's my go-to source is the Wall Street Journal.
Thank you.
Probably New York Times.
Washington Post.
Jeff Bezos up there.
I said we were a diverse group, right?
Wikipedia.
Wall Street Journal with hesitation. Even the Wall Street Journal, which has the impression of being his history of being conservative, I'd say the editorial board still is. But the news side's getting a little bit different. So everything with a grain of salt.
I thought you were going to say they hesitate because they print your stuff once in a while.
That was a great question. So where do you go? What's your one source?
NBA.com.
I'll give you an example. I wanted to find how many people died from guns. So this is a couple of years ago. I got really interested in this. How many people actually die from guns? Who's right? Who's wrong? How does it actually happen? So I'd actually tried to find the numbers. Like, how many people die from this type of gun? How many people die from this? So I did it all. And the only place I could get any numbers by the time I spent 2 hours online was a government report, believe it or not.
Well, don't count on that.
Well, no one else had it.
Appreciate your answer. You, sir.
Yeah, I never expect the truth from the news media because I don't think they know it and they don't have the time to search it out, especially for the time that's relevant. What I expect to hear is what they do know, and then it's up to me to sort out what the truth is after that. Now, I know most people aren't going to do that. It's just like Reed. If I remember that one time he lied right up in Congress. I can't remember what the subject was. Later on, they were interviewing him in an interview, and they flat out told him, said, "You lied." He said, "Yeah, but it worked."
Just to follow up on...
I don't expect the truth from the media. I expect you to report what you know. Then it's up to me to determine the truth. And I especially don't trust the government to tell me the truth. So them controlling any media is like asking China to control the media, or Russia, or Saudi Arabia. Would you trust those sources?
That's a good point. Bob?
Well, what's interesting, just to follow up real quickly on what Bob said about his go-to source being Wikipedia, and this is relevant to some of the topics we were asked to speak about tonight, which is Wikipedia is a decentralized source of knowledge written by hundreds and thousands and millions of people, while the former, the Britannica, the World Book that I grew up with, is centralized by a priesthood of experts, while Wikipedia is broad-based. And some people say, you know, anybody can change Wikipedia, so I can't believe anything that's on there. But the fact that anybody can change Wikipedia is its strength.
But have you ever submitted an article to Wikipedia? Anyone?
They have a lot of structures.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's
you have
not
to be
easy. It's not easy to get them to publish an article.
There can't be a page about Bob Weeks of Wichita, Kansas, because they have a notability criteria.
They're tough editors, and they look at your stuff and they say if it's not even written in the right style, they'll reject it and send it back and say this is not objective reporting. That's what they want, and they enforce it.
There's an example, isn't it?
Doug Dees?
I'm interested in Mr. Weeks' model, only because I think that you guys tend to be representing newspaper and local TV news, both of which I think are headed for death. But I think the citizen journalist may be the future. But I'm not familiar with your work, so I'm wondering, are you doing journalism, or is it just more editorialism? Secondly, is it an act of love, or are you profiting from it? And thirdly, if you are profiting from it, how does that affect your content?
Well, I think that whether it's journalism or not, I'll let other people decide. But as far as my model is, you know, I work part-time, freelancing various type of things in my former field of information technology, plus working for political candidates even, because I know how to handle data. So that kind of puts me at the edge of being involved in the process, but trying to report on it as well. But is it an act of love? Well, to me, it's more kind of an act of hate in almost some ways, because the transformation I had the transformation I had back in 2004 was that as from conservative to libertarian. So naturally, being a libertarian, you're very skeptical of government and everything about it.
If you get on our blog site and look at his bio, I think there's links to your publication in the bio, so you can find it there.
Do you feel like you're competing with the newspapers, TV, or you basically compete with them?
Well, I think it's an alternative source, but I mean, I report lots of news that the traditional news media in this town won't touch for one reason or another, or simply choose not to touch, or don't have the capability to do it.
I don't know if compete is the right word.
Yeah.
I think of Bob as someone who tries to hold legacy media accountable.
And I do have
Amen.
a point of view. I mean, very explicitly now on my site it says individual liberty, limited government, economic freedom, and something else for in Wichita, Kansas. So I mean, those are the stories that I want to write about. Now, some people will say, well, why don't you're always too negative about Wichita and so forth like that. Well, the city of Wichita has paid people who sit in City Hall all day, who are paid to, I would say, spin good news about the city of Wichita. The state of Kansas has that. The federal government does. The Sedgwick County. They all have that. So I'm not going to do their job for them.
I do find
made a good news
they're
reporter.
going more and more out to sites that are the digest type sites, where they're giving you links to other, whether they be the big sources like New York Times and ABC, or whether it be small sources of individual bloggers. You know, things like the Drudge Report and Huffington, that, as far as I can tell, aren't generating a whole lot of journalism themselves, but working as a portal.
Well, there's some benefit to that. I mean, to say, look, here's what the New York Times says, here's what the Washington Post says, or so forth. But there's also great need for original reporting. Just a couple weeks ago, I got the Kansas State Department of Education to send me the enrollment and employment statistics for Kansas schools this year. And shockingly, there are more teachers this year in Kansas than there were last year, more certified employees than last year, and a lot fewer students this year than last year. But yet the editorial pages of all of our newspapers tell us that, teachers are leaving the state in droves and class sizes are exploding. I mean, people-teacher ratio is not the exact same thing as class size, but that's some data there that you'll not often find. And the problem I have is, how do I get an audience for that? Since I'm working on a volunteer or part-time basis, I can't afford to advertise on Facebook or other places.
Well, it's classical what you just said was you're giving a comparison of the others. when you give those comparisons, and if you ask for feedback, that's what social media is all about. They're getting a different feedback. If you welcome the feedback and you compare the information, that's what grows.
Dave, are you welcome to get all the feedback you get when from Facebook?
I'm sorry, what?
Are you happy and welcome to get all the feedback you get?
Yeah.
On posters.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and I mean, I've actually had to file a couple of police reports over threats of violence. And that's true.
At
And
least you knew how they felt, right?
yeah, but yeah, because it's an opportunity. I get a lot of really harsh criticism, whether I post it on our Facebook page or on a comment to a story on the Eagle or some other site. But I really look for those opportunities. I don't mind them at all. You just have to learn how to blow that stuff off. Because one of the things we've learned is that for every person commenting on a story, there's probably 10 to 20 people reading the comments. They're just never going to comment. But that's an opportunity where you can be the adult in the room and just try to civilly deal with the issues and say, no, that's, okay, I understand, you probably heard that, but here's the government link to where you can go get the data. Here's this, here's that fact you haven't been told. So it's really a great opportunity, and that's where, I know Bob has had the same thing, where you have people come up to you afterwards and say, hey, I was reading that comment, and that was really, it made me think. So social media you have to put up with a lot of nonsense, but it's a great opportunity to really connect with people.
I'd like to end at 8:30. Be faithful to the time. Let's have a last question that each of you would ponder and answer. What is it that you see in the next 5 to 10 years in the news industry? The dissemination of information, the condition of the American electorate, hope for the future. What needs to happen? What do you see happening that would be good?
I can tell you what I'd like to see.
What you'd like to see.
I can tell you what I'd like to see.
What you'd like to see.
That in the same way that I said that Bob is someone that kept legacy media honest, certainly kept me honest when we were going back and forth about bond issues and things like that. I really had to be on my game. But what I would challenge every person, myself, everyone on the panel, is to go out and try and articulate the point of view of people who have an alternate view of yours. And it's not until you do that, I think, that you're really getting at what is at the heart of journalism. That, embarrass my friend over there, but Paul and I used to debate a lot in the newsroom. He had a point of view that was unfamiliar to me. And it wasn't until I could understand his point of view that I felt like I could fully serve an audience as an honest arbiter. And my ability to articulate that point of view helped me in that subsequent, in my columns and in my subsequent journalism work. That we come from a point of view. I think if people read my column, they'd feel like I had a point of view. I thought what made me better was when I could articulate an opposite point of view than my own. And that until we can do that, there's no bridge. I mean, there's no bridge to trust until we can start doing those things. And so what I'd like to see is, I'd like to see MSNBC, for example, be able to do something about conservatism in America. And I'd like Fox to be able to do something about progressives that, and I'd like for it to be something that people in opposite audiences could consume and think, I thought that was well articulated, because we're not understanding each other. We're talking past each other. And as long as we stay in these camps, nothing is going to change.
Well said. Each of you gentlemen?
Well, I just hope that I can continue to tell the truth as best as I can possibly discern it, that other people do the same, that we admit and correct our mistakes when we're wrong, and that we do, as Mark said, treat each other with respect and the dignity that that they deserve. And I don't know, it just seems we're going the other way for some unfortunate reason.
Wow. The trends I think are going to continue about, in the business that I'm in, toward more consumption of information through the internet and screens and decline of printed newspapers. But I do think, though, that there's good stuff being done by legacy media on the internet, on digital platforms. And I read it every day, especially, if you're following the new administration, Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the stuff on my news feed that Apple gives me just sort of sets it right up there for me, And there's some good stuff, and there, some of those big news operations are devoting more resources, I think, to cover these changing times, and so that's encouraging. I have this. It's probably a little bit of a pipe dream, but I have this notion that because one of the issue that we're talking about has got us all kind of sort of confused, a little baffled, a little disoriented, and ungrounded, that maybe the legacy media will have a little bit of resurgence because if you're, I've imagined billboards that we put up on our communities, Facebook fatigue, you're confused about digital media, digital depression, that's good alliteration, right? Sit back, relax, read the Courier Traveler, we'll separate the wheat from the chaff, or something like that. I've already thought this through. So, maybe, and I'm not the only one who's articulated this, but maybe, there will be, things will settle a little bit, and people will become a little bit more literate in their consumption of information, and it's probably my fault we didn't get to talking about how to find reliable sources, but because I kind of diverted it, but, that may emerge from all this. I don't know, but I kind of hope that it does, and I really liked, I know I'm going on here, but I really liked what you said. I've got some opinions about what I think, government should or shouldn't do, or the city commission should or shouldn't do. But I try sometimes to say, I might be wrong. I might be wrong, and that guy actually might be right or have a point. So maybe I can kind of meet you there on that, and try not to cling so hard to my belief in how I think the world should operate. That I can't sort of see you as somebody who might have a good idea too. That's difficult.
Yes, sir.
Good. 2 more and then we're done.
Okay. In terms of what I think is going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, in terms of media, I don't think it's going to, in and of itself, get any different. It might get worse before it gets better. And I say that from my own experience with dealing with a lot of media executives. I don't believe they have the courage to change how they do things. Some of it's corporatization. There's a lot of different reasons. So instead of waiting for something else to change, we're taking action. That's one of the reasons. I do have a great deal of faith in entrepreneurs. I think that there's going to be, whenever there's a serious problem, somebody thinks of a way to do it. And it might be what David was talking about. For our part, that's one of the reasons, one of the motivations that James Franco and I and a few others, and Al Higdon here, helped get the Sentinel started. Because there's a niche, there's a need not being met. People, it doesn't matter left or right, Republican or Democrat, people don't trust a lot of what they get from anybody on the media. So we put that site together. We think it's an opportunity. Now it's nonprofit, so nobody's trying to make money at it, but it's an opportunity to help people understand what they aren't getting, and say, okay, so there's, whether it's wrong, you didn't get this perspective, there was information completely left out. So we're trying to do that. And we're also, at Kansas Policy Institute, we're trying to be much more conscious about how we talk about issues. If you can get people to ever sit down and think about what they're really trying to accomplish, not how they want to get it done, but what they want to get done, there's not a lot of difference. We all want well-funded schools because what we really want is well-educated students.
That's right.
We don't want to have low-cost, lousy service, but the polarization has kind of put us in this, it's an either or. We're having to make choices between bad or worse. We have to do a better job as a policy institute of explaining that, no, it's really not that. We have to understand we have problems. So how do we solve a problem without making something else worse? And there's ways to do it. So it's understanding that this isn't about being right or wrong. I mean, there's some things that are right or wrong. How much we're spending on something, that's a number. What we should do, that's perspective. There is no right or wrong. We can all have that, but what are we trying to accomplish? Let's try to move away from measuring how much we care about something by how much we spend on it, whether that's in government or what I spent on my son's present, and what are we accomplishing? Measure our outcomes. Let's work together on trying to make things better for everyone. Don't make this a choice. We have to get away from this notion that for some people to win, somebody else has to lose.
Well said, Dave. Excellent.
Thanks.
Sir?
Oh, my greatest concern is lack of competition. And whenever the government is involved, whether it's net neutrality, whether it's interest rates being zero, you are crushing competition somewhere. And when you begin to crush competition, you destroy diversity, you destroy all sorts of other things that you can't even begin to appreciate until later. When you suddenly have a problem and you say, how did we get here? And as long as we are willing to be bought off as a population with cheap tricks and by politicians in Washington who are motivated just like publishers, they're seeking something other than truth. They want the money. Okay? And as long as we're willing to be bought off, or as long as we are incapable of even understanding that we're being bought off, news is basically a pedagogical function. Pedagogy means learning. How do we learn? Okay? And what we have today is learning is being controlled by the government and by big business. Crony capitalism is business and government coming together, and they're controlling our entire diet. From the moment we're born till the day we die. They start us on it in fifth as 5-year-olds. If we're lucky to be able to stay at home for 5 years, some of us don't even get that long. And from 5 years on, we're fed a diet of partial truths, of partial falsehoods, of propaganda. And the people who are spooning it out to us may be well-meaning, but the people who are making sure that we eat it are not well-meaning. They do not have our good at heart. And they will do everything they can to reduce us to modern-day slavery. And that's where I think we're headed. And unless there's a slave revolt, and unless the slaves start to think, there will be no change in what's happening to us.
Could I do a PS? Very quickly.
It's 8:38.
Okay.
Yep.
One other thing I think we all need to be able to do is to be willing to admit when we made a mistake. And I just did. Because I was giving my little speech and looking over here, and if I had looked over here, I would have realized I forgot to mention that Paul Sutar is also one of the board members and founders of the Sentinel. So, mea culpa.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the essence of New Symposium. Let's thank our panelists. Joey? Wonderful job, fellas. Very nicely done. Very nicely done. Audience, thanks for